I've taken the same quiet back roads home for years, but after last week, I'll never drive them again. I just can't, not after what happened. It was late, close to 11:30 at night. I just wrapped up a meeting with a client who wouldn't quit nitpicking every tiny detail of their website redesign. At that hour, the back roads seemed like the better option. No headlights in my face, no stop-and-go traffic, just the steady hum of my car and a long stretch of deserted road. Usually that drive clears my head, but not that night. That night was different. About halfway along, I spotted hazard lights blinking up ahead, just beyond a bend in the road. My first thought, someone's car must have broken down. Out of habit, I eased up on the gas, figuring I could at least roll down the window and ask if they needed a hand. And then I saw him. There was a guy crouched down on the shoulder, right by the ditch. At first, I couldn't make out what he was doing. It looked like he was digging through something. Maybe he'd hit a deer or a coyote and was checking it out. I nudged closer, and when my headlights caught him, everything became clear. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. The man was hunched over a body, his hands buried in its chest. Blood covered his face, dripping off his chin, and I swear to God, he was eating, tearing off chunks of flesh like it was nothing. My foot slammed on the brakes so hard the tires squealed, and that sound must have startled him because he jerked his head up. For a few seconds, we just locked eyes. I'll never forget his face. His eyes were wide, empty, like there was nothing behind them. Blood was smeared across his cheeks, thick and dark, almost like war paint. Then slowly, he smiled. Not a friendly smile, but a sick, deliberate grin that made my stomach churn. His teeth were red, coated in blood. I couldn't move. My brain felt stuck, like it was refusing to process what was happening. He stood up then, and that's when I realized he wasn't just looking at me, he was coming toward my car. No, not coming. Running. He bolted at me so fast I barely had time to react. My foot hit the gas and the car lurched forward. My heart was pounding as I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was chasing me, his grin stretched impossibly wide, his legs moving like some kind of machine, each step eerily precise. He kept up for maybe 100 feet before he just stopped. He froze in the middle of the road, standing there like a statue. I didn't stop. I didn't even think about it. I just kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they hurt. I didn't let myself breathe until I pulled into my driveway. When I finally parked, I stayed in the car for a while, trembling like a leaf. I tried convincing myself he was just some drugged-out lunatic. That's what people do, right? It's easier to believe that than to face what the alternative might be. My house isn't much, just a simple one-story place with a decent yard. Most nights, it feels cozy and safe, but not that night. That night, every shadow seemed like him. I locked all the doors and windows, then double-checked them, triple-checked them. I sat on the couch with my back pressed against the wall. I don't even own a gun, so the best I could do was grab an old baseball bat from the closet. I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind brushing against the siding set me on edge. Around 2 a.m., when the motion light over the garage flicked on, my heart nearly stopped. I peeked out through the blinds, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Just my empty yard, still and silent. Maybe it was just a raccoon, or so I told myself. Maybe. By the time morning rolled around, I'd almost managed to convince myself that I'd blown everything out of proportion. Maybe I'd misinterpreted the whole thing. Maybe that guy was just some disturbed weirdo trying to freak me out. But then I saw the footprints. Bare, muddy footprints tracked up my driveway, stopping right at my front door. I hadn't imagined anything. No, he had been there. After that, my house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt off, like something was lurking, just out of sight, like I wasn't alone. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. I even tried to rationalize the footprints. Maybe some stupid kid thought it'd be funny to mess with me. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, deep down, I knew the truth. It was him. The second night, around midnight, the motion light outside flicked on again. I didn't rush to the window this time. I sat there on the couch, gripping the bat so tight my knuckles ached, trying to talk myself out of looking. But in the end, my curiosity won. I pulled the curtain back, just enough to get a glimpse. At first, there was nothing, just the empty driveway, as still as a photograph. But then I noticed something near the porch, a small pile of rocks stacked neatly in a tower. I hadn't seen it there earlier, and that's when my phone buzzed. The text was from an unknown number. No words, just a photo. It was my house, taken from somewhere near the edge of my yard. In the picture, I could see myself standing by the window, peeking out. My stomach turned to ice. I didn't sleep a wink that night. As soon as the sun came up, I called the cops. The officer who showed up was polite enough, but I could tell he wasn't taking it seriously. I walked him through everything, the footprints, the rocks, the photo. He wrote it all down, nodding like he'd heard this kind of story before. Probably just a prank, he said, shrugging. Kids like to mess around, you know? I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But I couldn't. He held up the printout of the photo I'd given him. We'll pass this along to the tech guys, see if they can trace the number. If anything comes up, we'll let you know. That evening, I drove straight to the hardware store. I came back with security cameras, new locks, and floodlights. By the time I'd installed everything, it was already dark. It didn't make me feel much safer, but at least it was something. The cameras gave me a shred of hope, like maybe if I could see him coming, I'd have a chance to do something about it. But when night fell, they failed me completely. Around 1 a.m., I heard a faint tapping on the living room window. My pulse jumped, and I immediately checked the camera feed. Static. Every single channel was just static. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Clutching the bat, I forced myself to creep to the window and take a look. Nothing. The yard was as empty as ever. I tried to calm myself, but the tapping didn't stop. It started moving, from the living room window to the kitchen, then the bedroom, circling the house like some predator toying with its prey. By morning, it was gone. When I went outside to check, I found more footprints. They led to every first-floor window in the house. That was it. I grabbed my phone and called my best friend, Edward. I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. Edward showed up later that afternoon. He didn't look convinced, but said he'd stick around. "It's probably just some creep trying to scare you," he said, shrugging. "But hey, I'll stay for a couple nights. Safety in numbers, right?" That night, we stayed up late, drinking and cracking jokes to lighten the mood. For a while, it worked. I almost felt normal again. But as the hours wore on, Edward started to let his guard down. A few beers and a late night will do that to anyone. "Come on, man," he said, laughing as I nervously glanced at the window. "You're acting like this guy's some kind of boogeyman." Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, chuckled, and got to his feet. "I'll take this outside. It's kinda loud in here." "Are you kidding me?" I snapped, my voice sharp with panic. Edward smirked and pulled a small switchblade from his pocket, flicking it open with a casual click. "Relax, man. I'll be fine. Let the guy try something. This little beauty'll sort it out." I tried to stop him, pleaded even, but he just shook his head and laughed. "Come on, Jason. You're way too wound up. I'll be back in 5 minutes, tops." Before I could say anything else, he stepped outside and shut the door behind him. At first, everything seemed fine. I could hear his voice drifting in from the driveway, muffled but steady as he paced back and forth. But then, out of nowhere, there was a scream, a sharp, guttural sound that froze me in place. "Edward!" I shouted, grabbing the bat as I bolted to the door. When I threw it open, the driveway was empty. Edward's phone lay face down on the concrete, its screen cracked and glowing faintly. A dark, glistening trail of blood stretched from where the phone had fallen, leading straight to the edge of the woods. My stomach turned. For a moment, I couldn't move. "Edward!" I yelled again, my voice cracking with panic. Nothing, no response, just silence. Shaking, I stumbled back inside and locked the door behind me. My hands were trembling so badly it took 3 tries to dial 911. The police arrived faster this time, maybe because they heard the terror in my voice, or maybe it was the blood. Flashlights cut through the darkness as they scoured the area with dogs, searching every inch of the woods. Hours passed, but in the end, they came up empty. No body, no sign of Edward. One officer approached me, his tone calm but skeptical. "You sure your friend didn't just wander off? Maybe he got hurt and couldn't find his way back?" "No," I said, my voice shaking with frustration. "He wouldn't leave his phone. And what about the blood? You think he did that to himself?" The officer raised an eyebrow. "How much did you say you boys had to drink tonight?" I know how this looks, I snapped, anger bubbling under my fear. But Edward wouldn't just disappear. You have to keep looking, please. Another officer stepped in, placing a hand on his partner's shoulder. We'll keep searching, he said gently. If you remember anything else, call us. I wanted to believe them. I really did. But their expressions told me everything I needed to know. They didn't expect to find him. The next day, Edward's sister called. Her voice trembled with barely contained panic. What happened? Where's Edward? I don't know, I stammered. He went outside, and then I heard him scream. I called the cops, but what? She demanded. They didn't find him, I admitted, the guilt in my chest twisting like a knife. Her sobs broke through the line, and then the call abruptly ended. That night, the cameras failed me again. Static filled every feed, the screens flickering uselessly as my heart pounded. Clutching the bat, I crept toward the kitchen window, every step slower than the last. I stopped just short, hesitating. My hand hovered over the latch before I finally slid the window open, letting the cold night air hit me. At first, there was nothing, just the quiet rustling of leaves. Then I heard it. Jason? The voice was faint, but there was no mistaking it. My name drifted through the trees, drawn out in an eerie, mocking whisper. Jason! A chill ran down my spine, but fear quickly gave way to anger. Clenching the bat, I leaned out the window and shouted into the night. You hear me, you sick freak! I'm not scared of you. You think you can keep this up? I swear, you'll regret it. Movement at the edge of the woods cut my rant short. He stepped into the moonlight, his face twisted into that same sick grin. In his right hand, the blade of Edward's switchblade gleamed faintly. In his left, my stomach turned. It was a hand, Edward's hand. He lifted it slowly, almost playfully, and waved, a grotesque, mocking gesture. Then, locking his soulless eyes on mine, he brought the hand to his mouth. I gagged as the sound of tearing flesh reached my ears. He bit into the severed hand deliberately, chewing slowly, savoring every bite. That grin never left his face. I stumbled back from the window, bile rising in my throat. Slamming it shut, I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. He's here, I gasped when the dispatcher picked up. He's outside my house. He's got my friend's hand, and he's eating it. The dispatcher's voice was calm but firm. Sir, listen to me. Get to a safe location immediately. Officers are on their way. Shoving the phone in my pocket, I grabbed a duffel bag and started throwing things into it. Clothes, my laptop, anything I could think of. I called Maggie, a coworker, begging her to let me crash at her place. She didn't hesitate. Of course, just get here. Every muscle in my body was tense as I packed, ears straining for any sound outside. When I finally glanced out the window, he was gone, vanished into the woods like a shadow. By the time the police arrived, I was already gone, speeding down dark streets toward Maggie's house. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was one of the officers who'd searched my property. Jason, he began, his voice careful, measured. We found something during the sweep. My stomach dropped. What did you find? There was a pause, and then he spoke softly. We found a hand. It matches your description, and we believe it's Edward's. I'm so sorry. The room seemed to spin as I sat down hard, the phone clutched in my trembling hand. Just his hand, I whispered. For now, the officer replied gently. We're still searching for the rest. I know this is hard, but we're doing everything we can. My chest tightened as I struggled to absorb his words. Did you trace the number? I asked, my voice shaking, desperate for any distraction from the horrific images flooding my mind. The officer hesitated for a beat. Yes, the number belongs to a man who was reported missing a few weeks ago. We believe there's a link to your case, and we're actively investigating it. I promise we'll find out what's going on. Thank you, I whispered, though the words felt meaningless. I know this is terrifying, he added, his tone softening. You're doing the right thing by staying somewhere safe. If anything else happens or if you remember something, call us immediately. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I will, thanks. We'll keep you informed, he said before ending the call. I set the phone down carefully, my hands trembling. Their words were kind, but the truth was undeniable. I was no closer to understanding this nightmare or escaping it. I stayed at Maggie's for a week, barely holding myself together. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, and when I did manage to drift off, I woke up drenched in sweat, the man's bloodied grin etched into my dreams. Maggie didn't push for answers, but I could tell her patience was wearing thin. I couldn't blame her. My paranoia was suffocating. When I told her I planned to go back home, her worry spilled out instantly. "Jason, are you sure that's a good idea?" she asked, her voice careful but firm. "The police told you to stay away. Edward is still missing, and they haven't found whoever's responsible." "I can't hide here forever," I said, though even I wasn't convinced. "It's my house. I can't let him take that away from me." Maggie folded her arms, concern etched across her face. "And what if going back puts you in more danger? What if you're walking straight into another nightmare?" I hesitated, gripping the strap of my bag. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I can't live like this anymore. If I don't go back now, I probably never will." She sighed, shaking her head. "Fine, but promise me, Jason, if something happens, you'll call for help. Don't try to handle it alone." "I promise," I lied. When I pulled into my driveway late the next morning, everything looked the same as I'd left it. The curtains were closed, the lawn undisturbed, the house standing silent and still. But inside, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating, like the house itself was bracing for what might come next. Determined not to let fear control me, I got to work. I installed deadbolts and extra locks on every door, making sure they'd hold against whatever or whoever might try to break in. I upgraded my security cameras, positioning them to capture every possible angle and sync the feeds to my phone. Floodlights now bathed the front yard in harsh, unrelenting light, leaving no shadows for anyone to hide in. And I bought a gun, along with enough ammunition to ensure I was ready for anything. For a few days, I convinced myself I was in control. The house still felt wrong, but I'd done everything I could to make it safe. The police added extra patrols around the neighborhood, promising to prioritize any call from me. I didn't believe they could actually stop him, but it was better than nothing. Then one morning, my fragile sense of security crumbled. I opened the door to find something waiting on the porch. At first glance, it looked like trash, just a bone and some meat, but the smell hit me before I could get closer. The bone was long, streaked with fresh blood, and the meat was raw and putrid, flies already swarming it. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. By the time the police arrived, I was in the kitchen, clutching a coffee mug with shaking hands. They bagged the evidence, took pictures, and promised to look into it. But their eyes betrayed them. They were just as lost as I was. The next day was worse. Bloody handprints streaked the walls and front door, smeared like someone had dragged their fingers across the surface. The day after that, I found more bones on the porch, this time arranged in a spiral. I stopped calling the police. What was the point? They couldn't stop him. No one could. That night, my unraveling began. Food lost all appeal. I survived on coffee and scraps, barely aware of what I was eating. Sleep was impossible. Every creak, every shifting shadow sent me spiraling into panic. I stopped going to work, stopped answering my phone. Voicemails from friends and family piled up, Maggie's voice growing more desperate with each one. But I couldn't face them. This was my nightmare. No one else should have to bear it. I spent my nights in darkness, gun in hand, glued to the camera feeds. Deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. It was a little after midnight when I heard it. The sound was faint at first, just a whisper carried by the wind. But as it grew louder, my blood ran cold. A voice, sing-song and mocking, called out from somewhere beyond the house. "Jason." I tightened my grip on the gun, the cold metal slick with sweat. Slowly, I crept to the second-floor window, where the sound seemed closest. The window was cracked open, the night air chilling my skin. "Jason!" The voice came again, drawing out each syllable. I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and aimed it into the yard. For a moment, there was nothing, just the stark, floodlit grass. Then he stepped into view. The beam caught his face, grinning and blood-streaked, his teeth glinting like jagged shards. He stood at the edge of the woods, dragging something behind him. My stomach turned as I realized what it was. A body. Limp, pale, and unmistakably human. Our eyes locked as he crouched down, raising the body's leg. With methodical precision, he began slicing into the flesh, carving off a piece. I watched, paralyzed, as he brought it to his mouth and bit down. "What the hell do you want from me?" I screamed, my voice cracking. He paused, chewing slowly, savoring the bite. Then, for the first time, he spoke. "I want to know what you taste like." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Before I could react, he dropped the body and bolted toward the house, running on all fours like a rabid animal. I stumbled back, heart hammering, as he slammed into the front door with a deafening crash. The house trembled, the locks groaning under the impact. Then the sound of shattering glass erupted from downstairs. He was inside. I sprinted for the bedroom door, the gun clutched tightly in my hands. His footsteps thundered up the stairs, each one faster than the last. When he burst through the door, I didn't think. I just fired. The gun's roar filled the room, and he staggered back, a crimson stain spreading across his chest. But he didn't fall. He snarled, relentless, and came at me again. I fired once more, then again, and again. The bullets slowed him, but only briefly. Blood poured from his wounds, yet he didn't stop. His grip was iron as he lunged, grabbing my arm. I fired one last desperate shot into his shoulder, but he didn't even flinch. His teeth sank into my shoulder, tearing through flesh. I screamed, pain exploding through me, but adrenaline surged, and I slammed my knee into his gut, freeing myself just enough to aim at his head. I fired. This time, he fell, his body hitting the floor with a sickening thud. But even as blood pooled beneath him, he twitched, his body refusing to die. I watched as his fingers twitched, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. I couldn't give him the chance to recover. Grabbing his legs, I ignored the sticky warmth of his blood coating my hands and began dragging him toward the stairs. He groaned faintly, but there was no fight left in him. The basement door loomed ahead, its shadow stretching across the dimly lit hall. I yanked it open and heaved him down the steps. His body struck each stair with a sickening thud until he landed in a crumpled heap on the concrete floor below. Without hesitation, I slammed the door shut, threw the bolt, and shoved the heaviest dresser I could find against it. For a moment, the silence was deafening, but it didn't last. The pounding began, a violent, relentless assault on the door that made the wood groan and splinter with each strike. The dresser shook with every impact, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. Panicking, my eyes darted around the room. That's when I saw it, the gas canister sitting by the generator in the corner. I'd bought it weeks ago, worried about power outages that could disable my cameras and floodlights. Now it was my only shot. I grabbed the canister, unscrewed the cap, and poured a steady stream of gasoline under the basement door. The pounding grew louder, more ferocious, as the door began to crack. My hands trembled as I struck a match and tossed it into the puddle. The flames erupted instantly, roaring to life and racing up the door. The pounding stopped, replaced by a sound I'll never forget. A shriek so raw and inhuman it made my blood run cold. It wasn't fear, it was fury, primal and unrestrained, echoing from the depths of the basement. I didn't stick around to see what came next. Grabbing my keys, I bolted to my car, the heat of the flames licking at my back. By the time I reached the street, the house was fully engulfed, the fire consuming everything. But as I sat in the driver's seat, gasping for air, that scream echoed in my ears, a reminder that this wasn't over. I drove until the sun crept over the horizon. My shoulder throbbed where he'd bitten me, the makeshift bandage I'd fashioned from my shirt soaked through with blood. The pain was unbearable, but the thought of explaining the wound to a doctor kept me away from any hospital. I eventually found myself at a dingy roadside motel, far from the city and everything I'd left behind. The room was cheap and grimy, but I didn't care. I shoved the dresser against the door, locked every bolt, and collapsed onto the bed. Sleep came in restless bursts, every creak of the building jerking me awake. The next few days blurred together. I couldn't go back, but I didn't know how to move forward either. The house, if it was still standing, was likely a charred skeleton, and I couldn't face the fire department or the police. What could I even say? That I'd burned my own house down to kill a monster? They'd laugh, or worse, lock me up. Eventually, I moved to a new city, miles away. My new home was a tiny, forgettable studio apartment with one redeeming quality, a sturdy, bolt-heavy door. I convinced myself it was a fresh start, a way to rebuild. But deep down, I knew it was just a hiding place. Each night, I triple-checked the locks and sat in the dark, knife in hand, watching shadows that refused to sit still. My dreams were worse. His face haunted me, his blood-soaked grin stretching impossibly wide, splitting his face in two. He'd lean in close, his voice a low, taunting whisper as he called my name. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, clutching the knife so tightly my hand ached. For a while, the nightmares seemed like they might fade. The city felt bigger, safer, and the memories softened, taking on the edges of a bad dream. But nightmares have a way of bleeding into reality when you least expect it. It was a Wednesday night when the illusion shattered. I came home from work, exhausted and eager to collapse with a microwave dinner, but as I approached my apartment door, my stomach turned. Blood smeared the surface, fresh, vibrant, and dripping down to the floor in thick streaks. I froze. My breath hitched as I took a step back and knocked on my landlord's door. She answered with an annoyed look that quickly shifted to alarm when I pointed out the blood. "Oh my God," she whispered, grabbing her keys. "Wait here, we'll check the cameras." It didn't take long to find the footage. The timestamp read 3 a.m., and the black and white feed showed a figure standing motionless outside my door. Its face was obscured, but the dark stains smeared across its features were unmistakable. Blood. Even through the grainy resolution, the broad shoulders and unkempt hair were chillingly familiar. I felt my stomach twist as the figure moved. It ran its hands across my door, smearing blood with slow, deliberate strokes. Then it turned to the camera. Its face tilted upward, and there it was, the grin. That same sick, twisted smile, unmistakable and haunting. The figure leaned closer, filling the frame. Its tongue darted out, dragging across its lips in a grotesque display. And then, as if speaking directly to me, it mouthed a single word. "Jason!"